Hello, welcome to Nashville Savvy. This is your host, Megan Leipitz-Seidlich of the Pamphleteer. And today we have a special treat because we got to sit down with Attorney General Jonathan Skrmetti yesterday. He talked everything from Pearl Jam and Ticketmaster. I know if you're a Swiftie, you realize that that's been a big deal this year, to just what it's been like being the new Attorney General for 1 year. So we're going to be playing through that interview. Some of the more interesting parts of this interview that I really loved that we'll do clips of if you don't make it through the 37-minute interview and you just want some bite sizes, he really goes into what it is that his office does. Sometimes the Attorney General, it could be a little bit, hey there, I see some people in here. It could be a little bit confusing what the AG actually does. He is one of the most powerful people in the state, but what does he do? So he goes through all of that along with a few other tips, tricks, and things that are up his sleeve. So we're just going to go right in it today. Thank you guys so much for joining in, and let me know in the comments if you have any questions. Hi there, and this is Megan Leipitz-Seidlich with Nashville Savvy, coming to you from Nashville, Tennessee. And I'm standing and sitting here, of course, with our Tennessee Attorney General, Jonathan Skrmetti. Thank you so much for being on.
Thanks for having me again.
So it's been a year since we've talked to you, and a year since you started your new job. And I can remember the first day when you walked in to do a podcast with the Pamphleteer, and you were fresh out the gate. You were still not used to having bodyguards. And how does it feel a year later? Are you used to hearing the term General Skrmetti yet, or is it still weird?
It's still super weird. And I constantly thank my children and my wife for keeping me grounded and not letting this stuff go to my head, because there are just so many accoutrements, and I get why they're there, but I think it would be really easy to let that kind of define your life for you if you let it. And I'm still, just the same guy trying to do my best. But it's weird. It's a much different life circumstance than I ever envisioned. And there's good parts and bad parts of it.
Man, you're only year one, and you have 7 more years to go. It will become like a lifestyle after that long. Do you think that you'll like get used to it ever, or you think that, like you said, you still need to have that grounding back at home?
I mean, I think if I start getting used to it, I'll probably start doing a pretty bad job. So hopefully I never take it too much for granted.
Fair enough. I wish more people thought the same way you did in positions like yourself. So over the last year, obviously you and your family have changed your lifestyles. Sacrifices have been made. I do recall when you were first interviewing for the job, how excited your son was to be there. We talked about that. Has anything changed as far as, obviously your family is grounding you at home, but has their life had to change drastically, or do they literally just, you come home and they ignore the fact that during the day you're now the Attorney General?
I mean, they'll listen when I do radio hits, and they think that's kind of neat. And sometimes we'll drop the kids off at school on the way into work, and they think that's pretty cool. They get to ride in a trooper's car. But it hasn't made any like huge differences. The money's not that much different from what I had before. And the schedule's pretty busy, but I had some pretty busy jobs before. I had a fair bit of travel before. So it's not a huge change. I think the biggest change is like the people who just come up to me who either don't really know me or who, are sort of know me and are a lot more engaged in wanting to be typically encouraging. A lot of people come up and just say something nice, and, they don't really interfere, but they just want to be encouraging. I think that takes some getting used to for me and for my family, just because it's really out of the ordinary.
You're all of a sudden getting approached.
Yeah. Or there are a few times where I'm pretty sure someone knows who I am when I like introduce myself to them at a church thing or like a little league thing. And it's a little, and then I'm like, gosh, I hope they're not too mad about something, or, you just never know. But it's a really neat job. And I feel very blessed for it. And, the biggest thing for my family is I've got a really good chance to try to make Tennessee a better place for them to grow up.
Absolutely. Before we get into some of the stuff that you've accomplished and you've gotten the ball rolling on throughout the last year, it sounds to me like, well, for one, it's been an interesting year in politics in the state of Tennessee. Of course, we got out of the General Assembly, and as we were closing that down, it was quite interesting up on the Hill at the Capitol. And of course, we just had the special session. Has that impacted your office in general, or is it kind of two separate things?
I mean, it's not really formally impacted us that much. We did have some litigation relating to the House rules. And that was, that put a couple of our people in a pretty contentious spot, right? They had really good legal arguments dealing with a very discrete legal issue, but it was in a context where people's passions were running really high. And so I think it's a little bit tough on the line attorneys. Most of them don't expect to be in the middle of high profile stuff like that. So it's a challenge to make sure that morale stays up when you're in particularly contentious areas like that. And then the other issues are, we had a very busy session with a lot of laws. We're still defending a number of those laws in some potentially really significant constitutional litigation. And so there are people working hard on those cases, and it'll be interesting to see how they turn out. But I think until we get clarity from the courts of appeals, it's going to stay very contentious, and we're going to see a lot of kind of ancillary litigation related to this stuff.
Absolutely. Well, before we jump in, do you have a highlight of the year or a low of the year or both? Do you want to share either of those with our listeners?
So the high of the year is hearing that the NCAA was not going to issue a bowl ban to the University of Tennessee. There was a big investigation, an internal investigation that UT did. They cleaned house. They fired a bunch of people. They were very transparent about it. And there was still a risk that the NCAA was going to just drop the hammer on them and take this team full of kids that hadn't done anything wrong, take these coaches that hadn't done anything wrong, take this administration that had done everything they possibly could to fix it, and still give them a really severe penalty. And that's just not fair. The thing that I try to do in this job is fight back against concentrations of power, whether that's in the corporate world where you've got companies or groups of companies taking advantage of people, whether it's with the federal government with too much power in the executive branch. Well, the NCAA is an institution where the power over college athletics is very concentrated. And so it felt really good to be able to push back successfully on behalf of those kids.
Speaking of, so that's a high. Maybe we'll save the low for another time.
There are definitely some lows. We can talk about those later.
Maybe we need something stronger than coffee to go about the lows of politics, right? But, you talk about holding different entities accountable. And I know as you walked into the office, you were really hoping to put together a special unit of lawyers. Did you end up being able to enact that this year? And how's that going?
So the General Assembly voted on the governor's budget, and it had the unit in it, the strategic litigation unit. We got funding for it. It's taken a little bit of time to get the ball rolling on hiring. We really needed to find the right director for it and build around that. Well, we got the director. We've got a couple more people in the unit, and we have some more interviews coming. But we got this wonderful native Tennessean. She's from Franklin. She lived in DC for a few years, and she was ready to come home. And she is just an extraordinarily talented attorney. So I think she's going to be doing some great things. She's got some great support. We've got one person moving over within the office. We've got people coming in from outside the office. And I think we're going to have a very sophisticated regulatory litigation group here. They're going to do some other things. There are a lot of state laws that they'll be involved in defending. There's some ESG issues they're going to look at. But by and large, I think the focus early on is going to be on the administrative state, federal regulation, and really just the metastasization of the federal executive branch and what we can do to stop that.
That's what a lot of our readers are really excited about, the fact that you wanted to create this unit and to really put a check on some of that federal overreach, to push back against some of that, because sometimes it feels like we're alone out here, we're just watching it all happen to us. So you're kind of that man in the position you're in to stand that ground for obviously this state. And while we're at it, you're arguably, if not the most important, one of the most important and powerful positions in the state of Tennessee. Sometimes I think that, somebody like me who isn't necessarily policy savvy. I didn't go to law school. Sometimes I get really drudged down by some of the technical terms. You are a position that actually stands up against basically the federal government on the behalf of the state, but then you also stand up for the citizens of our state. Do you want to explain a little bit more about the position of an attorney general? Because I think that sometimes, us normies out here, we don't really know what you do.
Sure. So, I mean, the number one fact is it is a big office. I've got about 190 attorney spots here when they're all full, about 160 support staff, and we deal with about 13,000 cases at any given time. So there's a lot going on. And that, most of our work is in kind of bland stuff. It's legally interesting. It's important. It needs to be done right. But it's everything from defending suits where someone's car gets damaged by a pothole when they're on a state road, dealing with bankruptcy claims that the state may have on a bankruptcy estate, litigating state tax issues where there's a disagreement about the technicalities of state tax law, representing the state when there's employment litigation, when someone says they were terminated wrongfully or discriminated against in a promotion decision or something like that. We deal with bond issuances by the state. We deal with real estate transactions. We deal with eminent domain. And then there's consumer protection. There is tobacco. We deal with public records. So there's a huge number of cases that come through here, most of which nobody ever hears about or cares about unless something goes wrong. And then there's that sliver of really high profile things. And usually that has to do with either constitutional litigation where we're defending the state, or with constitutional litigation where we're representing the state's interests against the federal government. And that's a key part of federalism that's been kind of put by the wayside. And, over the last decade and a half or so, it's really started to pick up again. The other big thing we do is consumer protection. And there have been some huge successes there. It's a long tradition in this office to be a strong consumer protection state. I am definitely not the originator of this success. When I came in as Chief Deputy Attorney General 4 years ago, one of the things I worked most on was opioids, where General Slattery was one of the, 2 national leader AGs. And I was involved in a lot of those negotiations, day to day for a very long time. And we're still, working through some of those cases, but I don't know what the exact total is, but it has to be close to $1 billion in settlement funds that are going to be coming into the state over the next 20 years. And there are other big cases that we're looking at, big cases we're in the middle of on the consumer protection side. And that by itself is a huge commitment and a significant amount of work on behalf of the state.
Yeah, so I remember when you first got in and we had talked about some of this stuff, it was some big shoes to fill, but also a lot of forward thinking, especially when it comes to things like ESGs and some of the technological stuff that I want to touch on right now. So when we're looking at what you've done this year, before we move to what you want to do in the future, let's look at ESGs. You had a couple like some letters that you had signed on with other attorneys general. You had some things that you did with ESGs this year. And what else do you want to do as we go into next year?
So we're still looking at the ESG situation, and it's a broad term that encompasses a lot of things. If a company is offering consumers a choice between an ESG oriented investment vehicle and one that doesn't involve ESG, that's fine. Like, they're allowed to give consumers choices. That's a good thing. People should be able to make those decisions. If they're not transparent and they're doing a lot of ESG oriented decision making that potentially has an adverse impact on investors, there has to be transparency there. But my biggest concern with ESG is some of these alliances across industries where you have, say, the financial sector unifying, saying, we're going to do everything we can to ensure that fossil fuels are not consumed to the same degree, or make other essentially policy decisions, but without the accountability of democracy. So they're depriving consumers and they're depriving entrepreneurs of opportunities based on their own policy preferences. Well, if a bunch of companies get together and collude to do that, that is a naked violation of our antitrust laws. And one of the things that my office is supposed to police is, open markets. We need to make sure that there isn't that sort of collusion at consumer expense. And so we've been looking very carefully at that. And there are some complicated issues involved here. But I think it's pretty clear that this is something that's been of interest. And so, it's going to remain a topic of interest. We've sent out some CIDs. There was some reporting on that. We're looking at what we got back. I don't want to pick a fight over these cases if there's not a case to be made. So I think you have to be careful about laying the groundwork. But if there are antitrust violations, if there are consumer violations, I have the authority and the obligation to do something about it. So, there's no clear outcome looming in the immediate future, but this is something that I'm very concerned about. And I think we need to make absolutely sure that we don't find ourselves in a situation where a group of corporate elites have decided they know better than the American people how to run the country. I mean, we're a democracy, we're self-governing, and we need to stay that way.
Talking about somebody who has a monopoly on things, you were involved in, I think it was consumer protection when it had to come with the Ticketmaster, the Taylor Swift concert, everything was on fire. And then General Skrmetti came to the rescue, or at least helped with. Want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So again, sometimes it takes a while to work through things. I was not particularly subtle about my concerns here. I was in high school when Pearl Jam testified in Congress about the structural problems in ticketing. The structural problems in ticketing are still there. Now, we have seen some improvement over the last year, and I like to think that part of that is because the AGs and the federal government all started really looking at these issues. There are still some problems out there, and I think you can anticipate that my office will continue to look really, really hard at those problems, and we'll see where that goes.
Now, does it make it easier when you have something that catches more attention from the media when you're litigating or putting forward these cases, or does it really not matter? Just out of curiosity.
So I think it causes companies to start to behave better when there's scrutiny and it's out there that there's this scrutiny. I think you see that in ESG too. I think a lot of companies are a lot more careful about what they're saying now. They're a lot more careful about the commitments that they're making than they were a year or two ago. And same in ticketing. I think you're seeing more transparency in ticket prices and service fees. Part of that's legislative. And I think you're seeing at least more care taken with respect to the competition issues. I don't know that that solves the problem, but I think it makes a difference. I mean, when people know that the spotlight is on them, they're going to make sure that they're not doing anything too obviously bad in the public eye.
That's a good way to put it. Too obviously bad. Sunlight is certainly a good disinfectant. And so obviously you're kind of the I don't want to call you the last line of defense, but I'm sure that the weight of some of these things weigh so heavily on your office that it probably helps a little bit if there's a little more pressure and a little more scrutiny from the general public at large. But speaking about something that needs a little bit more light shed on it, let's tap on the fact that you just signed on to a bipartisan, I think it was 54 states and territories. You're going to have to explain that to me.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, I didn't know
there are
that there
56 AGs. There are 56 AGs. We got the 50 states, DC, Guam, Northern Marianas, American Samoa, the Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico. So when we have our AG get-togethers, there's 56 AGs there, and getting 54 is unheard of. I mean,
that's wild.
It's a lot of AGs.
I was so confused about, I had no idea that there were AGs in other territories, but this was a bipartisan letter that was sent to Congress, and it's really looking into, or asking them to look into, the dangers of AI, especially with child exploitation. Do you want to speak more into that? Because I know that you're really into looking into how tech companies and these other technologies do exploit the most vulnerable, which include children.
Sure. So, I mean, this is a technology that's not new, but it's rapidly accelerating. And so we don't know exactly what all the different applications of AI are going to look like going forward, but we know you're able to do deep fakes using this technology. You're able to find really effective ways to manipulate people if you've got software that's looking to do that and training to do it better and better. So with social media, there were loads of unintended and unexpected consequences, and some of those had a really negative impact on kids. With AI, I mean, there's the obvious like simulated pornography issues there, and that's something that came up before, but I think it's going to be significantly more impactful research going on in people viewing deepfakes and how even if they know they're deepfakes, there's still a really visceral reaction that can affect their decision making, influence their emotions, and just even though it's totally made up and they know it's totally made up, there's still something there. Well, child pornography is illegal, but if somebody's faking it on AI, especially if they're faking it using images of real children as the basis for it, that can have significant consequences, especially on the kids if they know that this is out there. But there are all sorts of different ways that AI is going to be harnessed. As people take these troves of data and work on them using machine learning tools and gain the ability to exploit us in ways that have never been done before, just really sophisticated ways of understanding the structure of human psychology and figuring out where the vulnerabilities, where the shortcuts are. It'll be like social media on steroids. Social media is designed to be addictive. It's designed to give us what we want. It's designed to affect us in ways that we don't understand. And this is all the same potential problems, but more so. So social media, there was the opportunity to exchange child pornography. AI, there's the opportunity to manufacture child pornography. And there is some First Amendment law dealing with that. But I think because the technology is so different and the impact on people is potentially radically different than the relatively crude tools we had in the past, that may drive a reexamination of the law, that may drive additional regulation. There's a lot we don't know. And so this is a call for studying the impact of these issues, for making sure that as the technology moves very, very quickly, we're less behind than we were. Because traditionally, the government regulators are miles and miles behind where the technology is. But the potential impact of this is such that we have to do our very best to keep up.
Yeah, and this is a hard topic because it's, on one hand, regulation, you don't necessarily want to over-regulate. That takes away the purpose of freedom, but there's so much danger in who knows what you can see come from this. So I'm glad somebody is out there trying to at least have us evaluate it and anticipate what may come instead of just reacting once it's obviously already too late. Firsthand, I know that you had a case when you were when we're talking about exploitation of children, and not just on the internet, but like in real life as well. I know that you've dealt with human trafficking here in Tennessee. I think it was when you were working in Memphis.
Yeah, it was when I was a federal prosecutor in Memphis.
And I know when you first came on the scene, Mr. General, that we know that you really cared about that topic, and we just saw a bill passed during the special session, of course, that will compile some data so we can actually see what this human I guess it's not just human trafficking in the sense of child sex trafficking, but it's also, labor human trafficking and such, that we'll be able to see a more complete picture of what exactly is happening across the state. Do you hope to see anything, perhaps something that would benefit how your office can tackle some of this happen during next General Assembly? Or is there anything that you're looking into because of this data that they're going to compile?
I mean, I think it's great that they're looking at this data. I think it's been 10 years since we did a comprehensive review. And it's important to get a sense of where things are in the state before we make any policy decisions. I am open to helping however I can. This is an issue that matters a lot to me. I had cases involving a lot of trafficking victims, all sex trafficking. I did a couple labor trafficking cases, but all the ones that went to trial, all the ones where I really got to know the victims, it was all these horrific sex trafficking cases. And like, once you get exposed to that world, you can't not want to do what you can to make it better. And so depending on whatever the data says, we're here to support the DAs. We're here to provide whatever we can to the state to make sure that this is being addressed. We want to make sure we're dealing with all the victim issues that arise out of this, and supporting the DA victim coordinators, supporting the child advocacy centers. We want to be a resource to help however we can. And so depending on what exactly the data says and where the holes are, I'm glad to put resources toward it. I'm glad to work with the legislature, to be a good partner with everybody else working in this space. I don't want to come barging in and take anything over, but I think there's a real opportunity in a variety of ways for the state to do things better. We're doing it better than pretty much any other state right now, but that's not good enough. And I think this reflects an understanding by the General Assembly and the governor's office that we need to keep constantly striving to be the best we can, because the victims just need it. I mean, we should do everything we possibly can to help these people.
Absolutely. And you brought up something, and we'll try to wrap this up. I know you're a busy, busy man. So you brought up DAs, and of course you do want to coordinate and help DAs across the state. But we also know that unlike your position, which is an appointment by the Supreme Court justices, these DAs are also politicians. They're elected off a popular vote. We have some that are a little bit less than willing to, perhaps, I'm trying to be like politically appropriate. How do I say that? They don't always want to follow the lead of the state legislature. And they might not do the things that perhaps, they are being asked to do. We see that here in Nashville, Tennessee. Our DA has refused to prosecute a multitude of things, including things that have to do with abortion and things that have to do with marijuana and such, which is an interesting position to be in. But when you run into those problems, we brought this up the first time we talked about it, but since then we have seen something happen where basically, do you want to explain exactly how the bill that was passed this year kind of, I guess, I don't want to say polices some of these rogue activist DAs, but perhaps keeps a check and balance in place?
Sure. So the bill that got passed deals with post-conviction litigation in capital cases. And so post-conviction means just that. It means once the DA gets a guilty verdict and a death sentence out of the jury, everything that happens on that point comes to my office. In the past, we would handle all the appeals and we would handle all the federal post-conviction litigation, and the DA's offices would handle the state post-conviction litigation. And you get these situations where, the case would be tried, there'd be a verdict, it would go to appeal, we would get the appeal. We would have the appeal for years. Our victim liaisons would work with the victims' families for years. And then it would start ping-ponging back and forth. The institutional knowledge wouldn't necessarily be there in the DA's offices. Some of the issues that came up were fairly specialized. And if you're in an office that has, there's a relatively low number of these cases in any DA's office. But particularly if you're in one where there's just a couple of these cases, it's pretty hard to start from scratch and develop that knowledge. And there was an issue that came up in a case that was decades and decades old. It was a murder that happened in the 80s, and the conviction came down in the 80s. The victims' families have been waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting for justice, and we'd had the appeal for ages. And then the defense attorneys for the defendant came in and said, well, actually, he's intellectually disabled. And there was a DA's office that just took their word for it, didn't do their own independent investigation, didn't take it to a judge and make the best case that the defense position was wrong. And so, after decades and decades of very hard-fought litigation to preserve the integrity of that conviction, to test it over and over to make sure that it was legitimate, that the victim's family was just devastated. I had a long conversation with the victim's sister, and she was crying most of the time through that. she said it was like he was killed all over again, you know, that she didn't get any notice of it until after it was already done. And, you know, I've got people that work really hard on those cases. We take it very seriously. The idea is never to, you know, lock down the penalty. It's to make sure that we're providing the state with quality representation, put forward the best case, and the judges are a check to make sure that the state's not overreaching, that the state's not doing anything illegal here. And to have that adversarial system compromised at the expense of a victim's family was brutal. And so the General Assembly passed a law that said from now on, once the DA's office decides to seek the death penalty, and once they obtain a verdict for the death penalty, it all comes to my office, and it just stays here the whole way through. That's in litigation right now. There's a case that's going up on appeal. The trial court ruling was that that exceeded the scope of the AG's authority. And I think it's going to be really interesting going forward to see what the court says. Now, there are some situations where I have prosecutorial authority. They're very, very narrow, very limited. The structure of our state traditionally has been the DA's prosecute, but there are a few situations where the legislature has given that authority to the AG's office. Depending on what the appellate courts say in this situation, that may have some impact in either direction on what that looks like going forward. And so, you know, we're waiting to see how this turns out. But in the meantime, you know, I've got folks that work very closely with the victims in these cases, and we want to be sure the state's doing everything right. But part of doing everything right is putting on the best case for the state as a way of securing justice for those victims. So, you know, we take this seriously, and we're making the best case we can that this law is valid and should stay on the books.
Well, it sounds like you have a lot on your plate. In fact, I feel like, do you ever get tired of things getting litigated and then, like, you know, everything gets questioned, everything is taken to court,
everything? No, so I'm working on an op-ed right now for Constitution Day, and that's part of it. I mean, we live in a democracy, a republic, but, you know, we have democratic principles guiding everything. And at the end of the day, most of our disagreements should be resolved by votes and not by courts. And we're in a situation where every time somebody loses in the legislature or in any sort of political decision-making process, they immediately litigate. And it's effectively an abdication of our ability to govern ourselves. And in the long run, it is decaying our democracy in a way that we will have to work really hard to remedy. So listen, I don't mind litigating. I'm a lawyer for a reason. I love taking things to court, but it's not how we should run our state. There are times when you bump up against the constitutional guardrails and legitimately need to be checked, either in terms of the substance or especially in terms of the structure of what you're trying to do. But there are a lot of times where people just need to be focused on persuading one another, and we're dragging the courts in to serve as sort of the super legislature. It's a terrible idea in the long run. And we've known this for a long time. And, you know, these days, everybody's got the courts that they don't like. So you know, no matter which side of the political aisle you're on, if it goes to court, at some point, you're going to be really unhappy with the court that's looking at it. And the best solution there is to just get back to our roots and focus on handling things like a democracy and taking responsibility for governing ourselves.
I don't want to push you in a direction that you don't or can't go, but do you feel like this is sometimes a strategy? We know how much longer things take in the court system, and sometimes as you're wearing the point out in some cases, it seems, at least, especially in how fast things have changed since 2020. Do you think that it's partially a strategy?
I mean, it could well be. You know, there are resource constraints on everybody. But when we had the LW litigation, you know, we had the ACLU, Lambda Legal, Aiken Gump had a bunch of pro bono people on it, and the Department of Justice. It was something like 20, 25 lawyers on the other side. So I think there is sort of a pile-on strategy to just try to overwhelm, you know, the government actors that are doing things that people don't like. And if democracy goes in a way that very well-resourced elites disagree with, you know, they have this mechanism to try to frustrate the will of the people. And again, like, judicial review is legitimate. The Constitution is there and it means something. But in so many of these situations, it's something that's left up to the people, right? The Constitution doesn't tell you what the answer is. It just tells you where the boundaries are. And there are a lot of decisions that we should be and are free to make within those constitutional guardrails. And trying to constitutionalize every issue is a huge threat to our democracy. There has to be a lot of room for us to deal with things through votes. And, maybe it is part of a broader strategy, or maybe it's every issue that comes up. We've got a pretty aggressive, pretty conservative legislature. They do things a lot of people don't like sometimes, and those people have lawyers. And so it's almost a way of protesting and trying to frustrate that democratic institution. But ultimately, the people have the authority. And if you don't like what the people's representatives are doing, either persuade the voters differently, persuade the elected officials differently, or recognize that you're not going to be able to convince people and you're not always going to get your way on these things.
That's interesting. I'm looking forward to reading that op-ed. I know from our perspective, we've certainly interviewed many people who it's a lot more difficult if you're a private citizen without deep pockets to, hold some of these institutions accountable. But we have seen a lot of, deeper pockets and nonprofits and such kind of pushing things into the court system time and time again. So thanks for at least, giving me a little bit more leeway there. We're going to look out for your op-ed on that one. Do you know where it's going to be printed?
Not yet. Not yet. I still
Okay,
need to finish it too, but it's going to be good.
It's going to be great. Awesome. Well, is there anything else that you would like to tell our listeners and our readers here at the Pamphleteer before we let you go on about your day?
No, I mean, I just really appreciate the interest people show in these issues. There are some laws that have gotten passed that have people very passionate, on both sides. And I think, obviously people get angry in the short run when they don't get their way. They get excited when they do get their way. But it's important that they pay attention and they see the structures that are used to make these laws, because understanding how government works is a critical part of a responsible democracy. Like if the voters don't understand, they're not going to make good choices. And so, as a kind of remedial civics education, some of this controversial stuff is really giving people insight into the process. It's giving people insight into, just the basics of our state constitutional system, how people take an idea and turn it into a law, how that law is tested in courts, how the courts of appeals sometimes come in and check the trial courts on these things. But, it's not going to work as a society if we don't have informed voters. And so everybody who's out there being passionate about this stuff, getting frustrated, writing about it, trying to persuade people, win or lose in the short term, that's good for the system in the long run. Everybody needs to have a better grounding in how our system works.
Fantastic. You have such a way with taking really dense topics and making it very approachable. And we always appreciate your forward facing willingness as somebody in such a high office as yourself. So thank you so much for coming on, General Skrmetti, and hopefully we'll see you again pretty soon. Maybe
Thank you.
We talked about doing like a half year or quarter year checkup, and we love to hear all the things that you're up to. So
sounds great. Thank you.
Have a good one.
You too.
All right, you guys, you heard it from General Skrmetti himself. Being civically active, or as we like to say, Nashville savvy, is important. And he wants to hear from the people. He loves to talk directly to people. I know that his office is pretty open if you ever want to reach out or have any questions. But thanks for joining us today. I want to touch real briefly on voting, because we're getting to the end of early voting here for Metro. Of course, we have the mayor's race. We have 4 council members at large, and we have a couple districted council positions that are still being fought for in these final days. The last day of early voting is this Saturday. Right now, we're sitting around 47,000 votes cast so far. So it looks like we might have a chance of at the very least, matching the amount of early votes that we had during the general election, a month ago. But it is important to get out there and vote. Of course, Election Day is on September 14th. So if you don't get your early vote in, you still have a chance to cast your vote in the runoffs on September 14th. It's an important race. It's going to determine where this city goes in the next 4 years, especially when you look at the stark differences between our two mayoral candidates. We have Alice Rowley, we have Freddie O'Connell. One is conservative, one is progressive. I just saw today Freddie O'Connell reaching out to some, he's really doubled down on a lot of this walkable, transit-oriented urbanization of Nashville. So your vote does absolutely count for the future of Nashville. So make sure that you do your research. If you have any questions or you're just trying to find resources, you can always find them on thepamphleteer.co. We have a voter guide up there. Of course, we've also been publishing all sorts of articles that you can read, but I also urge you to do your own homework and get multiple perspectives, talk to your neighbors, see if they've gone to any of these forums and heard from any of these politicians, because it is important to be civically involved. And yeah, as always, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next week.